Imagine you could be plugged into a machine that perfectly simulates any experience you desire. You could write a great novel, make a fortune, or simply feel uninterrupted bliss. The choice is between a guaranteed lifetime of flawlessly engineered synthetic pleasure and returning to a physical reality that guarantees pain, failure, and boredom. The philosopher Robert Nozick proposed this thought experiment to highlight a flaw in how we pursue happiness. Most people refuse the machine. Given the option, we choose to actually do things and to face real-world consequences, rather than just experience the subjective sensation of doing them. Yet in our daily lives, we often build smaller versions of this exact machine. Ancient Greek thinkers, known as the Cyrenaics, argued that the only rational goal was to maximize present sensory pleasure. Modern consumerism and digital entertainment operate on this identical premise. This is a sharp departure from the classical Epicurean view, which taught that a good life relies on strictly limiting desires and focusing on the absence of pain. When we adopt the Cyrenaic model, we trigger what psychiatrist Viktor Frankl and others observed as the paradox of hedonism. If you make pleasure your explicit target, you become hyper-aware of the pursuit itself, which neutralizes the enjoyment you are trying to capture. We see this paradox actively playing out in contemporary process addictions. Compulsive shopping sprees and high-intensity gaming sessions function as real-world experience machines, isolating the user from reality in exchange for a temporary rush. Adopting a lifestyle of radical hedonism triggers a predictable decline. It forces a shift from active agency to passive consumption, creating a cycle that degrades biological regulation and undermines the stability of the family unit. This chart shows the concept of the happiness set point. It represents a baseline of psychological well-being determined by your genetics and early environment. When you purchase something new or win a game, you experience a sudden rush of positive emotion. But psychological stability requires the brain to remain alert to new threats or opportunities. To maintain that alertness, the spike must eventually decay, pulling your emotional state back down to the exact baseline where you started. The first mechanism forcing this return is sensory habituation. From an evolutionary standpoint, the brain quickly learns to filter out repeated external stimuli, so its processing power isn't overwhelmed. The second mechanism is cognitive adaptation. Once you acquire a new luxury or reach a new digital milestone, your baseline expectations adjust to this new standard. What was once a rare treat becomes a basic necessity. Together, neurological filtering and expectation adjustment create the hedonic treadmill. The brain dulls the impact of old pleasures, while simultaneously demanding higher standards for future satisfaction. To overcome these twin forces, you have to engage in exponentially higher intensity consumption. The effort required to feel a neutral state of contentment constantly increases. Attempting to elevate your happiness set point by injecting external stimuli defies human biology. The mathematical certainty of this cycle guarantees chronic exhaustion, laying the groundwork for clinical addiction. When evaluating process addictions, a common misconception is that the afflicted person is experiencing an overwhelming, irresistible amount of pleasure. To understand the actual mechanics, we look at the incentive sensitization theory. This model identifies two distinct neural pathways: the dopamine system, responsible for motivation, and the hedonic hotspots, which use opioids and endocannabinoids to produce pleasure. In the brain of someone trapped in a cycle of constant gratification, the dopamine pathway becomes a hyper-reactive wanting system. It assigns massive incentive value to cues like a sale notification or a game icon, generating an intense, raw urge to consume. Simultaneously, the opioid-driven liking system, the part that actually produces the subjective sensation of enjoyment, builds up tolerance to the constant barrage of stimuli. This chart shows the result. Chronic exposure to high-intensity behavioral stimuli causes these two systems to decouple. The urge to perform the behavior spikes, while the actual enjoyment derived from it plummets. This results in a state of compulsive wanting. The individual feels a desperate, mandatory drive to shop or play games, even when they no longer derive any meaningful pleasure from the activity. As this loop tightens, the extended amygdala incurs structural damage. It becomes hypersensitized to the absence of the stimulus, meaning time spent away from the behavior produces severe anhedonia, irritability, and withdrawal-induced anxiety. Further complicating this cycle is the subsequent impairment of the frontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex is responsible for top-down self-regulation. When its function decreases, the individual loses the physical capability to weigh long-term consequences against short-term impulses. The continuous pursuit of pleasure re-architects the brain to enforce a joyless loop. By impairing the prefrontal cortex, it strips the individual of voluntary agency, turning a leisure activity into a biological mandate. These neurobiological mechanics are officially classified by the World Health Organization as behavioral process addictions, with internet gaming disorder serving as a primary model. Modern video games are engineered to deliver interactive, high-velocity dopamine surges. Sustained exposure to these environments dramatically raises a person's baseline threshold for engagement. Compared to this synthetic velocity, traditional learning or daily employment feels intolerably slow. This mismatch leads to widespread cognitive disruption and heavy academic failure. We see the same structural pattern in compulsive buying disorder, clinically known as oniomania. Compulsive buying disorder functions as a critical emotional regulation failure. In this state, consumption is used to numb underlying psychological distress, rather than to acquire items. The behavior operates in a rigid cycle. The act of purchasing delivers a fleeting spike of euphoria, which is immediately followed by intense post-purchase shame and regret. That subsequent guilt acts as a massive stressor. Because the individual's primary coping mechanism for stress is consumption, the shame itself becomes the precise psychological trigger that restarts the compulsive cycle. This chart maps the broader psychological impact. It shows that hedonic motives, the prioritization of comfort and pleasure, are deeply negatively correlated with self-control, leading to persistent conflict between an individual's short-term actions and long-term goals. Process addictions force an individual to continually sabotage their own potential. They abandon long-term stability in favor of short-term evasion strategies that rapidly lose their effectiveness. This graph models the family structure not as a collection of separate individuals, but as an interconnected system, reliant on shared resources and mutual emotional support. When a behavioral addiction enters the system, the first casualty is often financial security, manifesting in a marriage as financial infidelity. The afflicted partner must rely on secrecy to fund their compulsion. Hiding purchases and maxing out credit cards depletes shared assets and severs the ties of marital trust, inflicting a trauma comparable to romantic infidelity. The downstream impact heavily penalizes dependence. The primary consequence of parental hedonism is profound emotional neglect. A parent fixated on 10-hour gaming sessions, or the high of consumption, is physically present but psychologically absent. They cannot provide the consistent emotional validation a child requires, leaving the child's psychological development completely isolated. This absence initiates a severe developmental cascade. Adolescents facing this form of systemic neglect show a significantly higher risk for severe anxiety and aggressive behavioral disorders. Children actively model the behavior they observe. By watching a parent use escapism, the child inherits these coping mechanisms, passing the trap to the next generation. Individual behavioral addiction is never contained to the individual. It acts as a systemic contagion that severs the financial and emotional ties required to sustain a functioning family unit. The pursuit of radical hedonism ultimately creates a biological cycle of wanting without liking, a psychological loop of attainment without satisfaction, and a sociological engine for family decay. The initial gateway triggering this entire sequence of failures is escapism. Using digital or commercial distraction to avoid reality paralyzes the individual. Real-world conflicts, debt, and responsibilities are left to compound until they become so overwhelming that the urge to escape feels like a mandate for survival. Escaping this cycle requires shifting priority to eudaimonic well-being, a framework defined by the pursuit of meaning, community investment, and personal growth. Cultivating these practices actively rebuilds the prefrontal executive control that hedonism destroys. It restores self-regulation and increases your tolerance for the friction of daily life. As Nozick's thought experiment suggested, you cannot hack your way to fulfillment by engineering a simulated reality. You must actively choose to remain in contact with the physical world, no matter how uncomfortable it becomes. Authentic human fulfillment is not the byproduct of endless dopamine spikes. It demands the active, courageous exercise of your agency in the real world.